2 days before Germany's surrender, a decorated night fighter pilot climbed into the cockpit of his Junkers 88 and made a decision that could get him shot by his own side before sunrise. His name was Herbert Giesecke, and he had 6 confirmed kills against Allied bombers, 2 Iron Crosses pinned to his tunic, and a secret that frightened him more than any enemy fighter ever had. Years earlier, he had built a life on the other side of the world, in South Africa, married, safe, thousands of miles from the war, now devouring his homeland. Relatives had dragged him back to Germany, back into a uniform he no longer believed in, and now, as the Reich collapsed around him hour by hour, he feared that when the British came, they would not treat him as a soldier. They would hand him over to the very people he had once tried to leave behind. His own commanding officer had already refused to let him run. Desertion, he was warned, would end in a firing squad. So Giesecke decided to act alone at first light on the 5th of May, 1945. He pointed his aircraft not toward neutral Switzerland or Sweden, the safe choices his comrades were already making that week, but straight across the heart of enemy Britain itself, gambling 2 lives besides his own on a small, unarmed island that had never once turned away a stranger from the sky. Did you grow up hearing stories about World War II? Press 1 for yes. A 2 for no. The airfield at Grove, in the Danish peninsula of Jutland, no longer sounded like a place preparing for war. It sounded like a place waiting for it to end. Ground crews moved between the dispersal pens with none of the urgency that had defined the Luftwaffe 5 years earlier. Fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer. Rumors traveled faster than orders. Now, and every rumor said the same thing in a different voice. Berlin hat fallen, the Führer was dead. The armies in the east and west were folding into each other like a collapsing tent. And somewhere north of Grove, British forces were already moving through Schleswig-Holstein, closing the last narrow gap of German-controlled Europe. Oberfeldwebel Herbert Giesecke stood beneath the wing of his Junkers 88 and watched the gray Danish sky the way a man watches weather that is about to change his life. He was a night fighter pilot and had flown that way for a long stretch of the war, flying the big twin-engine Junkers not to strafe columns or drop bombs, but to hunt his squadron. The first group of Night Fighter Wing 3 had spent the war climbing into darkness to intercept the British bomber streams pouring east toward German cities. Giesecke was good at it. 6 confirmed kills hung against his name in the unit's record. Bombers that had taken off from English airfields and never made it home because he had found them first in the dark. The Iron Cross First Class and the Iron Cross Second Class on his tunic were not decorations handed out for showing up. They were earned in the coldest, loneliest kind of combat the war produced, alone in a cockpit at night, trusting instruments and a radar operator's voice more than his own eye. None of that mattered anymore. Not to him, because Herbert Giesecke carried something the citation papers never mentioned. Before the war, he had left Berlin behind and built a new life in South Africa, part of the British Empire, married and settled, an ocean away from the Europe that was now tearing itself apart. When the war began, every German man of military age living abroad was ordered home to enlist. Giesecke had not gone. Month after month, he stayed in South Africa with his wife, hoping the order would be forgotten, hoping the war would end before it ever reached him. It was not forgotten. Relatives back in Germany wrote to him, pressed him, warned him of what would happen to his name and his family if he did not return. Eventually, the pressure won. He sailed back to a country he barely recognized anymore and put on a Luftwaffe uniform. He became, by every measure the records could show, an excellent officer, but the fear he carried onto that airfield in Denmark was not a fear of British fighters or American bombers. It was a fear of paperwork, of a British officer somewhere, cross-referencing names, of being identified not as a decorated night fighter pilot, but as a man who had delayed his return to the Reich for the better part of a year while his countrymen were dying. If the British occupied Denmark, and they surely would within days, he believed they would hand him over to the authorities of the very dominion he had once called home to be punished as a deserter from imperial obligation, a traitor twice over in the eyes of two different flags. Whether that fear was justified or not, he could not know. He only knew that he believed it completely. And that belief was enough to change everything. His crew knew something of what weighed on him, if not all of it. Unteroffizier Horst Schmidt, a Hamburg man who operated the aircraft's radar and wireless set from the cramped rear compartment, had flown with Giesecke long enough to read his moods through the intercom before a word was spoken. Gefreiter Bernhard Kruschein came from the coal country of Upper Silesia, a region that by early 1945 had already been overrun by the advancing Red Army. So that Kruschein had no idea whether his own family was alive, captured, or scattered somewhere ahead of the Soviet lines. Between the three of them sat an unspoken understanding. None of them wanted to fall into Soviet hands. All of them had heard what happened to German prisoners taken east. The long marches, the camps from which men did not return, British or American captivity was the best any of them could hope for. But for Giesecke, even that best case carried a private terror. The other two did not share. At night, the airfield smelled of wet grass and cold engine oil, and the silence between missions had grown thicker with every passing week. There were no more scrambles into the dark, no more voices crackling over the radio, calling out bomber streams inbound from the North Sea. The war that had defined Giesecke's entire adult life, the war he had fought skillfully enough to earn 2 Iron Crosses, had simply stopped needing him. He spent his days now walking the perimeter of the airfield, watching ground crews strip parts from aircraft that would never fly again, listening to officers argue in low voices about orders that changed by the hour. He thought often of the house in South Africa, of the particular color the evening light took on the veld, of a wife who had no idea whether her husband was alive, dead, or already a prisoner somewhere in the ruins of Europe. That distance, once a comfort, had become an ache. He carried everywhere. He thought about the men he had shot down, 6 bombers, 6 crews, young men flying for Royal Air Force Bomber Command, not so different in age or temperament from himself, flying through darkness on missions. They had been ordered to fly just as he had been ordered to intercept them. He had never allowed himself to dwell on it during the war. There had been no time, and dwelling on such things was a fast way to lose the edge that kept a night fighter pilot alive. Now, with nothing left to do but wait, the thoughts came anyway, uninvited, mixing with his fear of capture until he could no longer separate one kind of dread from the other. So he went to his squadron commander and asked, quietly, for permission to fly west before the surrender came. Not to defect in the dramatic sense the word implies today, but simply to place himself and his crew into Allied hands on his own terms. While there was still a choice to be made about where and how, it was not an unreasonable request from a man who had flown night after night against those same Allied bombers and lived to tell of it. Other Luftwaffe aircrew were already doing exactly that, slipping away towards Sweden, towards Switzerland, towards Spain, in 1s and 2s. As the collapse accelerated through the last days of April and into May, his commander refused. The order was simple and absolute. Germany was still officially at war to fly to the enemy now, before any formal capitulation, was desertion, full stop. And desertion in the last days of a collapsing Reich was not treated leniently by an army that still had the means to make examples of men. Giesecke was told to wait for the surrender that everyone could see coming, that the radio traffic and the retreating columns and the silence from Berlin all but confirmed was hours or days away. And only then would such a flight be permitted, or at least forgiven. It was, in its own bitter way, sound advice. Patience would have cost him nothing. The war in northwestern Europe, Giesecke and every man on that airfield understood, could not last much longer. A few more days of discipline, a few more days of waiting, and the entire question of where to fly and how would resolve itself without any risk at all. But Herbert Giesecke did not have a few more days left in him. Not the way his commander meant it. He had spent years already waiting in South Africa for a war he hoped would pass him by, waiting for relatives to stop writing letters that pulled him back toward a life he had tried to leave. Waiting now for a surrender that could arrive too late to matter if the wrong officer reached him first with the wrong questions about his past. He walked away from that conversation with his commander, having received the only answer available to him through proper channels. And it was not the answer he needed. That night, and through the following day, he began to think not about whether he would go, but about where. Denmark sat on the edge of a continent full of neutral ground within flying range of a fast twin-engine aircraft. Sweden lay close, just across the narrow waters to the north and east, and German aircraft were indeed turning up there that same week. Switzerland, tucked deep in the heart of the collapsing continent, was another well-known refuge, difficult to reach but not impossible. Spain, further still, had received German aircrew before, and would again in the days ahead. None of them felt right to Giesecke. He spoke English, a rare skill among his fellow officers, and he had heard, as many in the Luftwaffe had, stories about a small neutral country west of Britain that had treated, captured, and interned German airmen with a kind of correctness, even decency, that seemed almost unbelievable, given the state of the war raging around it. A country that was neither friend nor enemy, that followed the old rules of warfare even as the rest of Europe abandoned them. A country called Ireland. It was, en effet, the most dangerous option of all the ones available to him. To reach Sweden meant a short hop over water. To reach Ireland meant flying directly across the length of enemy held Britain itself, through airspace still bristling with anti-aircraft guns, still watched by radar stations, still patrolled by fighters that had spent 5 years learning to find exactly the kind of aircraft Giesecke flew. Herbert Giesecke had spent his entire war teaching himself to become invisible in the dark skies over Germany. Now he was about to test everything he knew in the opposite direction, flying not toward the men he had once hunted, but past them, praying they would not notice him at all. The refusal did not end the matter. It only moved it into a different kind of silence. The silence of a man who has stopped asking permission and started planning in private. Giesecke did not confront his commander again. He did not argue, did not plead, did not raise the subject a second time. Instead, he began, quietly and carefully, to prepare an aircraft and a crew for a flight that officially did not exist. He chose his moment with the same discipline he had once used to stalk bombers through clouds. Denmark was collapsing toward surrender by the hour. Every man on that airfield could feel it, in the way messages arrived and were not answered, in the way senior officers vanished into meetings that produced no orders, in the way the war seemed to be ending itself without anyone left to formally end it. Giesecke understood that the window for his flight was narrowing from both directions at once. Wait too long, and the surrender itself might trap him in Denmark, at the mercy of whatever arrangements the victors made for handling German personnel there. Arrangements he had no way to predict and no reason to trust, moved too soon, and he risked exactly what his commander had warned him about, a charge of desertion from an army that technically was still at war and still capable of enforcing its own discipline against its own men. He spoke to Schmidt and to Kruschine, not as their superior giving an order, but as a man asking two other men to gamble their lives alongside his. Neither hesitated for long. Whatever loyalty either of them still felt toward a Reich that was disintegrating around them, it did not outweigh the plain arithmetic of their situation. Kruschine, still without word of his family swallowed somewhere behind the advancing Soviet line, had perhaps the least to lose of the three. Schmidt, practical and quiet, seemed to view the flight less as an act of rebellion than as simple survival, no different in kind from a soldier choosing to surrender rather than die, defending a position that no longer mattered. Both men agreed to fly with their pilot wherever he chose to take them. Giesecke told them where, not Sweden, not Switzerland, not Spain. The destinations that other Luftwaffe aircrew were already choosing that same week, in the same scattered, unofficial exodus of aircraft slipping away from collapsing airfields across occupied Europe, Ireland, a small neutral island on the far side of Britain itself, reachable only by flying directly across the most heavily defended airspace remaining anywhere in Western Europe. When he explained his reasoning, that he spoke English, that Ireland was known to treat interned German airmen with a fairness almost unheard of elsewhere in the war, Schmidt and Kruschine did not object. They had already decided to trust him with their lives. The destination was simply one more decision in a night already full of them. Schmidt asked the only question that mattered practically, whether the aircraft carried enough fuel for a route so much longer than the short hops to Sweden that other crews were flying that week. Giesecke had already worked the figures more than once in his head, tracing the distance from Grove out across the North Sea, along the length of Britain and over the Irish Sea beyond, weighing it against what remained in the Junkers tanks after months of rationed, irregular supply. It would be close. There was no margin for a wrong turn, no fuel to spare for circling twice over an unfamiliar airfield while searching for a place to land. Kruschine said nothing about the risk itself, only asked when they would go, and Giesecke told him before first light. While the airfield was at its quietest and the chance of anyone noticing three men readying an aircraft that had not flown in weeks was smallest, in the very early hours of the 5th of May, 1945, with the sky over Jutland still dark and the airfield at Grove quieter than Giesecke had ever known it, the three men walked out to their Junkers, 88, for the last time. As members of the Luftwaffe, there was no ceremony to it, no farewell, no final briefing. No one to notice three men climbing into a night fighter that had every reason to be sitting idle like the rest of the grounded aircraft around it. Giesecke ran through his checks in near total darkness. The familiar shapes of dials and switches lit only faintly by the glow of the instrument panel. The smell of fuel and cold metal filling the cockpit the way it had on dozens of night missions. Before this one, behind him, in the cramped rear compartment, Schmidt settled in front of his radio and radar equipment, and Kruschine took up his position, all three men saying almost nothing to each other now that the decision had already been made and there was nothing left to discuss. The engines coughed, and steadied into the low growl Giesecke had heard 100 times before, though never quite like this. He taxied out into the darkness, lined up on the strip, and pushed the throttles forward. The Junkers gathered speed across the Danish grass, lifted, and climbed away from Grove for the final time, banking west and out over open water. As the airfield fell away behind them, unremarked and unpursued, at least for now, in the cockpit, Giseki felt the familiar vibration of the airframe settle into a steady rhythm beneath his hand. The same sensation that had once meant a hunt was beginning. Tonight it meant something entirely different. And he found himself listening for sounds that would not come. No ground control chatter offering vectors toward a bomber stream. No calm voice. From a controller he trusted confirming that everything ahead of him was exactly where it should be. There was only the wind noise, the engines, and the quiet, disciplined breathing of two other men who had placed their lives in his hands without a single word of complaint. He thought briefly of turning back, not because his resolve wavered, but because the habit of years spent flying disciplined missions under orders was hard to switch off in a single night. He pushed the thought away and held his course. He took the aircraft down low almost immediately, skimming just above the black surface of the North Sea, low enough that the curvature of the Earth itself would help hide him from the coastal radar stations. He knew lined the English shore. It was the same trick he had once used from the other side, dropping beneath the enemy's detection envelope to close on a target before it knew he was there. Now the tables had reversed completely. He was the target, the aircraft. Every radar operator on the English coast had spent years learning to identify by its silhouette and engine note, and his only defense was to become, as much as any aircraft that size could, invisible. The North Sea crossing passed in a long, dense monotony, nothing but black water below, and a lightning gray sky ahead as dawn began to catch up with them from the east. Schmidt monitored his equipment constantly, alert for any sign that a British night fighter had picked up their track. While Crusheen kept watch through whatever visibility the early light allowed, Giseki flew with both hands steady on the controls and his altitude never wavering, far from wave-top height. A discipline that left no margin for error, a moment's inattention, a single dip too low, and the crossing that was meant to save their lives would end it instead. 3 men and an aircraft swallowed by the sea without a trace. The cold seeped into the cockpit despite the engines running hot ahead of him, and Giseki's hands ached from the unrelenting grip. He kept on the controls, hour after hour of the same fine, unforgiving correction. Up a few meters, when a swell rose unexpectedly beneath them. Down again the instant it passed. The whole crossing, a continuous negotiation between the aircraft, the sea, and a pilot who could not afford to relax his attention even for the length of a single breath. Crusheen pressed against the canopy glass behind him, watched the water slide past in a gray blur and said almost nothing, though Giseki could hear him shifting occasionally, unable to sit entirely still despite the discipline the moment demanded. Schmidt's voice broke the silence only twice during the long crossing, each time to confirm that his instruments showed nothing behind them. No pursuing aircraft, no sign that Grove or any other German station had raised an alarm. Both times, Giseki felt the tension in his shoulders ease by some small fraction, only for it to return the moment the silence resumed. Land came into view first as a darker line against the gray, then resolved into the coastline of northeastern England near Middlesbrough. And Giseki understood in that moment that the most dangerous stretch of the entire flight had only just begun. He was no longer approaching enemy territory. He was inside it, a German night fighter crossing the English coast in broad, gathering daylight, over a country that had spent 5 years perfecting the art of finding aircraft exactly like his. He was seen almost immediately. Ground observers along the coast and further inland reported the aircraft multiple times as it crossed into England. The report of a low-flying twin-engine intruder passing from post to post faster than Giseki could have known. What saved him was not stealth in any complete sense, But speed and altitude working together against the limitations of ground-based tracking, flying so low and so fast, banking occasionally to follow the contours of the land itself, he made it extraordinarily difficult for anyone on the ground to fix his exact course with the kind of precision that would let fighter controllers vector an interceptor onto him in time. Reports came in confirming that something was there, low, fast, moving west, but by the time any single report reached someone with the authority to scramble aircraft, Giseki had already changed his position enough to make the information nearly useless. For a stretch of several minutes over the English countryside, Giseki caught sight of a single aircraft far off to the south, a shape too distant to identify with certainty, moving on a course that might or might not have intersected his own. He held his heading and his altitude, resisting the instinct to bank away sharply, knowing that any sudden dramatic maneuver would only draw attention faster than a steady, unremarkable line across the sky ever could, and trusting instead in the same patient discipline that had once let him close on unsuspecting bombers without being noticed until it was far too late for them to react. The shape never grew closer, never altered course, never gave any indication that it had seen them at all. Whether it was a patrol that simply never noticed him, or a training flight with no interest in a low-flying contact far below, he never learned, and in the cockpit that morning it made no difference either way. His heart continued to hammer against his ribs long after the other aircraft had vanished from sight. A reminder that every minute of this flight would demand the same unbroken vigilance until it was over. He crossed the high ground of northern England with the same unwavering discipline he had held over the sea, climbing only as much as the terrain absolutely demanded before dropping low again on the far side, until the industrial sprawl around Liverpool came into view on the western coast. It was, in its own terrible way, one of the most heavily defended stretches of airspace he could have chosen to fly through. A major port city that had endured years of German bombing and whose defenses, even this late in the war, remained alert for exactly the kind of solitary raider Giseki's aircraft resembled from the ground. He held his course regardless because there was no other way through, no path to Ireland that did not require passing near or over some part of defended Britain, and Liverpool, for all its danger, offered the shortest route to the open water beyond. Beyond Liverpool lay the Irish Sea, and for the second time that morning, Giseki found himself skimming low over open water with nothing ahead but the hope that the coastline eventually appearing on the horizon would be the right one. He adjusted course to keep well clear of Northern Ireland, still very much British territory and still capable of scrambling fighters or directing him into a trap he would not see coming until it was too late, curving instead toward the neutral republic to the south, Kruskine, watching the sea below for any sign of pursuit, found none, though he kept scanning the empty water and sky behind them anyway. Unwilling to trust the stillness after everything they had already survived that morning, Schmidt's equipment, as far as either of them could tell, registered no fighters closing from behind, whether that was because none had been sent or because the low, erratic flight path had simply defeated every attempt to intercept them. None of the three men could say for certain, and none of them cared to test their luck any longer than necessary. The light had strengthened considerably by now, the gray of early dawn giving way to a pale, watery morning that offered no more cover from the sky above than the black of night had offered from the ground below. Giseki found himself studying the horizon constant, searching for the first dark smudge of land that would tell him Ireland was finally within reach, while at the same time dreading what that same horizon might reveal if a fighter happened to be waiting somewhere along it. Every minute that passed without incident felt like a small, private victory, and every minute after that felt exactly as fragile as the one before it. Landfall over the Republic of Ireland came as a kind of disbelief more than relief. The green countryside below, utterly unlike anything the three men had seen in years of flying over, blacked out. Bombay and battle-scarred Europe. Fields and hedgerows and small farmhouses laid out below them, undisturbed by the war that had consumed everywhere else they had ever known. Giesecke throttled back and began looking for a suitable place to land, and he found it at an airfield near the coast in County Meath, at a place called Gormanston. He brought the big junkers around in a wide, careful circuit, studying the field below for any obstruction, any sign of activity that might complicate a landing he had not planned in advance and could not abort without risking a crash on unfamiliar ground. With fuel gauges reading close to empty, the wheels came down with a solid, reassuring thud beneath the fuselage, and Giesecke eased the throttles back further, feeling the aircraft settle onto its final approach, the way it had settled 1,000 times before over German soil. Except that every previous landing in his career had ended with him climbing out onto ground controlled by his own side. He set the aircraft down on Irish soil, the tires meeting grass instead of concrete, the airframe shuddering gently as it rolled to a stop, ending a flight of several hours that had carried them across 2 seas and the entire length of enemy Britain without so much as a single shot fired in either direction. What greeted them on the ground was not the reception of an enemy. Irish military personnel approached the aircraft cautiously, but without the hostility Giesecke might have expected. And he understood almost immediately that his instincts about this country had been correct. Ireland had remained neutral through the entire war, a position it had defended with a stubbornness that frustrated both the Allies and the Axis in equal measure, weathering diplomatic pressure from both sides without ever abandoning the policy. And that neutrality came with rules the Irish state applied with remarkable consistency. Aircraft and airmen of any belligerent nation that came down on Irish soil, whether shot down, damaged, lost, or simply arriving as Giesecke's crew had, were treated according to the Geneva Convention and interned for the duration of hostilities regardless of which uniform they wore. Giesecke climbed down from the cockpit first, raised his hands, and formally surrendered himself, his aircraft, and his crew to the Irish authorities who had gathered on the airfield to meet them. It was an astonishing moment for the men who witnessed it. A fully armed German night fighter, engines still ticking as they cooled, having simply appeared out of the morning sky and landed among them as though the war itself had briefly paused to let it happen. Schmidt and Crucian followed their pilot down onto the grass. And for the first time since leaving Denmark hours earlier, all 3 men allowed themselves to believe that the gamble had actually worked. There was a strange, disorienting quiet to the minutes that followed, the engines ticking as they cooled, the smell of scorched oil and salt air mixing with the ordinary scent of Irish grass after rain, and none of it resembling anything the 3 airmen had experienced during years of war. The Irish personnel who surrounded the aircraft kept their weapons ready but did not raise them, watching the German crew with an expression closer to astonishment than hostility, as though they too understood they were witnessing something that did not happen every day, even in a war that had produced so many strange and unlikely stories. Giesecke, standing on foreign soil for the first time in his life, felt the adrenaline that had carried him across 2 seas and the length of an enemy country begin to drain away all at once, leaving behind an exhaustion so complete he could barely keep his hands from shaking as he answered the first questions put to him. News of the landing traveled quickly. Word reached Irish officials in Dublin within hours, and word soon reached the British as well, because Ireland's neutrality did not mean secrecy, particularly not when it came to enemy military aircraft landing uninvited on Irish soil so close to the war's end. The Junkers 88 sitting on the grass at Gormanston was whatever else it represented to the three exhausted men who had just abandoned it. An object of real and immediate interest to the Allies, a late-model German night fighter that had crossed hundreds of miles of contested airspace intact, undamaged, and ready to be examined by anyone curious enough to look closely at what the Luftwaffe had still been flying in the war's final days. Within the Republic, officials moved with the same careful correctness that had governed every previous incident of this kind since the war began. A formal report went to Dublin describing the aircraft's type, the number and rank of the men aboard, and the circumstances of its arrival. And from Dublin, word passed through the channels. Neutral Ireland maintained, even with belligerent powers, through London. The British had lost track of exactly nothing in the war's final days, and a late-model German night fighter arriving intact, its crew alive and cooperative, its equipment undamaged by hostile action, was not the kind of news that stayed contained for long. Officers who understood the value of captured German technology began making arrangements almost immediately, long before Giesecke, Schmidt, or Krushin had any idea that their aircraft, and not simply their fate as internees, had become a matter of considerable interest across the water. An interest that would eventually bring one of Britain's most accomplished test pilots to Irish soil to examine what the three of them had unknowingly delivered into Allied hands. For Giesecke, Schmidt, and Krushin, the flight was over, but their war was not quite yet. They stood on a foreign airfield in a country that owed them nothing, watched by soldiers who spoke a language they did not understand, waiting to learn what neutrality would actually mean for three men who had bet everything on the idea that it meant something better than what they had left behind. The three men were separated from their aircraft within hours of landing, though not, as Giesecke had half feared, treated as criminals or as prisoners bound for harsh punishment. Ireland's neutrality had produced, over the course of the war, a peculiar and consistent policy toward the belligerent airmen who found themselves grounded on Irish soil, one that applied with equal weight to German and Allied personnel alike. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, as Ireland chose to interpret and enforce them, any combatant aircrew arriving from either side of the war was to be interned for the duration of hostilities rather than repatriated or handed to an enemy power, a policy that had already sheltered dozens of Luftwaffe and Royal Air Force airmen alike since the earliest years of the conflict. Giesecke, Schmidt, and Krushin were first held near Gormanston, in facilities that had already processed other airmen brought down over Irish territory or its surrounding waters during the war. In the days that followed, Irish authorities transferred them, along with the small population of other German internees still held in the country as the war in Europe finally reached its end, to a larger camp complex near the Curragh in County Kildare, a compound that had for years quietly housed the strange, almost unimaginable arrangement of enemies from opposing air forces interned within a shared network of camps on neutral ground. Exactly how closely German and Allied airmen mixed within that complex varied over the course of the war, and is not something the surviving record fixes with total precision. But the broad reality was unmistakable, all the same. Men who had spent years trying to kill each other from opposite ends of the same night sky, now living out the war's final weeks, separated by nothing more than the walls of neighboring compounds in rural Ireland. Life inside the camp settled into a rhythm none of the three newcomers had expected from captivity. There were huts to sleep in, meals that, whatever their limitations, arrived with a regularity none of them had known during the last chaotic weeks in Denmark, and hours of empty time that stretched out ahead of them with none of the constant tension that had defined every day since the war began closing in around Grove. Krushin spent much of that time turning over the same unanswered question that had followed him out of Upper Silesia. writing letters through the limited channels available to internees, hoping that somewhere behind the front that had swallowed his home region, someone might still be alive to receive them. No answer came during those first weeks, and the uncertainty sat with him quietly, a smaller echo of the same fear that had once driven his pilot to risk everything over the North Sea. Schmidt, more practical by nature, adapted to the routines of internment with the same steady calm he had shown behind his radio, set on the flight itself. And Giesecke, for his part, found himself surprised by how quickly the fear that had defined the last months of his war began to loosen its grip once the immediate danger had passed. He answered the questions Irish officers put to him about the flight, about his unit, about the state of the collapsing Reich he had left behind, openly and without the evasions he might once have practiced under different circumstances, and found that no hidden accusation ever followed. No mention of South Africa, no suggestion that his past held any particular interest for the men now responsible for his custody. For Giesecke in particular, the internment carried none of the danger he had feared back in Denmark. There was no British officer waiting to identify him, no demand that he answer for the years he had spent delaying his return from South Africa. No punishment beyond the ordinary confinement that came with being a captured enemy combatant in a country determined to remain scrupulously neutral to the very end. The fear that had driven him to risk his life and the lives of his crew on a flight across the length of enemy Britain turned out, in the most anticlimactic way possible, to have been unfounded from the beginning. Whether the British authorities in Denmark would truly have handed him over to South African jurisdiction had he waited for the formal surrender, no one could say for certain, least of all Giesecke himself, but the outcome he had gambled everything to avoid never had the chance to materialize at all. While the three airmen settled into the routines of internment, their aircraft became the subject of considerably more urgent attention on the other side of the Irish Sea. The Junkers 88 that had carried them across 2 seas, and the length of Britain represented something the Allies wanted very badly to examine up close. A late-war German night fighter, complete and largely undamaged, equipped with the kind of interception equipment the British scientists and airmen had spent years trying to understand and counter from a distance. Word of its arrival reached the Royal Navy's most celebrated test pilot, Captain Eric Brown, a man already famous within Britain's small community of aviation experts for flying more types of aircraft, including a long list of captured German machines, than almost any other pilot of his generation. Brown traveled to collect the aircraft personally, and by his own account relied in part on a briefing from the very man who had flown it into Irish hands, since the specific variant of night fighter Giesecke had delivered was one Brown had not personally flown before, differing enough from earlier models that a pilot's first-hand guidance mattered a great deal before attempting to fly it out of an unfamiliar airfield. There is a strange symmetry in the image, an Allied test pilot and a Luftwaffe defector standing together beside the same aircraft, the German explaining the particular quirks of an aircraft he had used against British bombers only weeks earlier, now helping ensure it flew safely into British hands for a few short hours. The two men, who might otherwise have met only as hunter and hunted somewhere in the night sky over Germany, instead worked side by side on the ground, discussing throttle settings and handling characteristics with the plain professional respect of pilots who understood better than most exactly what the other had risked to be standing there at all. Brown took the Junkers up from Irish soil and flew it across to England, where it would spend the following months and years under close technical examination at Royal Air Force Tangmere, evaluated by engineers and pilots eager to understand exactly what the Luftwaffe's night fighter force had still been capable of fielding in the war's final days. The aircraft remained there, subject to ongoing trials, until 1947, long after the war that produced it had ended. a quiet testament to how seriously the Allies took the technical intelligence Gieseke's flight had delivered, whether or not he had ever intended it as a gift for Giesecke, Schmidt, and Cruciai. Internment continued through the summer of 1945 in conditions that, whatever their discomforts, bore no resemblance to the fate any of the three men might have met had they chosen a different destination, or had they remained in Denmark to await a surrender whose terms none of them could have predicted with any confidence. Germany's unconditional surrender came only days after their arrival, ending the war in Europe entirely. Yet internment did not end with it. Ireland continued to hold its German internees for months afterward, working through the practical questions of a peace that had arrived without any established procedure for returning belligerent airmen from neutral soil back to a homeland, now divided among four occupying powers. It was not until well into that summer that the three men, along with the rest of Ireland's German internees, were finally released and given the means to travel home. The Germany that Herbert Giesecke returned to bore little resemblance to the one he had left behind in his cockpit over Grow. Cities lay in ruin. The government he had once served no longer existed in any recognizable form. The Luftwaffe itself, along with every other branch of the armed forces that had defined his adult life, had simply ceased to be. There was no unit to report to, no commander to answer for the flight he had made without permission, no court-martial waiting to punish a desertion that history had already rendered meaningless by the time anyone might have cared to prosecute it. The war that had once threatened him with a firing squad for the very act that ultimately saved his life had ended before that threat could ever be carried out. He did not stay in Germany long, with the country he had once fled and been forced to leave still standing on the other side of the world. Undamaged by the war that had devastated the continent, he stood on. Giesecke made the journey a second time, back to South Africa, back to the wife who had waited through years of silence and uncertainty without knowing whether her husband was alive, a prisoner, or lost entirely somewhere over the sea he had once flown to escape a war he no longer believed in. They were reunited there, in the same distant country that had once represented, in Gieseke's mind, both the life he wanted and the danger he feared most, and he remained in South Africa for the rest of his life. A former night fighter pilot with 2 Iron Crosses and 6 confirmed kills to his name, whose final and most consequential flight had never once required him to fire a shot. Schmidt and Cruciai, scattered to their own post-war lives, once released, each carrying his own private memory of that morning over the North Sea and England. A shared secret understood fully by only 3 men in the world. None of them had set out to make history, only to survive it. And in choosing the most dangerous route across the most heavily defended sky in Europe, they had somehow found the safest ending available to any of them.